this report this year is a contribution to the implementation of the Istanbul Plan of Action. As you know, the Program of Action details various policy measures and actions to be taken by both LDCs and their development partners over the next decade, and with the aim of accelerating growth, inclusive development in LDCs. And we are very pleased that the Istanbul Plan of Action has not only that it's ambitious and comprehensive, but also it has identified new areas, and areas that we are at UNCTAD very proud of, because we've been pushing some of these issues over the last few years through our report. For example, a greater focus is given to productive capacities, an issue consistently highlighted by UNCTAD. There's also a more pragmatic approach to science, technology, innovation, including concrete proposals to establish technology bank, and including International Science Technology Innovation Center. A great attention also given to the issue of graduation, as Dr. Tesfachew was saying, something which was missing in the past. And now there's expectation that at least half of LDCs will graduate by 2020. A special focus is also placed on emerging issues such as climate change. And of course, for the first time, the role of South-South cooperation in tackling the challenges facing LDCs is also given great attention. In fact, there is a whole section devoted to the complementary role of South-South cooperation in implementation of the Program of Action. If I may, Mr. President, quote paragraph 12, which gives context to this year's report, quote, guided by the spirit of solidarity with least developed countries, developing countries, consistent with their capabilities, will provide support for the effective implementation of the Program of Action in mutually agreed areas of cooperation within the framework of South-South cooperation, which is a complement to, but not a substitute for, North-South cooperation, end of quote. This is paragraph 12 of Istanbul Plan of Action. The 2011 LDC report addresses this specific issue and explores the potential role of South-South cooperation in the development of LDCs and the successful implementation of the Istanbul Program of Action. As discussed in the report and highlighted by Dr. Tesfachew, the intensification of South-South cooperation in recent years has opened up new opportunities for LDCs. And it seems that South-South cooperation has certain features that make it particularly appropriate for addressing the development needs of LDCs. However, the challenges facing LDCs are numerous and multifaceted, as we all know. It's important, therefore, that the enormity of this challenge is put in perspective, in the right perspective, before discussing how South-South cooperation can help. Let me briefly summarize the key messages of the report, and also challenges that LDC continue to face. Some of these points already touched by Dr. Tesfachew. First, in terms of economic growth, the report shows that despite strong GDP growth during the last decade, on average was 6.9 to 7.1%, especially between 2002 and 2008, the benefits of growth were neither inclusive nor sustainable, mainly because growth was not complemented by structural change or structural transformation and creation of employment. Now, structural transformation is something that we have highlighted in this report, and we intend to continue to address, because we believe that some of the progress in development, poverty reduction, comes when countries start to show real change in their structure, economic structure. So structural transformation for us is a real movement away from low value added to high value added products, from reliance on primary commodities to more manufacturing processing, a movement from low tech to high tech, labor intensive to more capital intensive. That kind of transformation and shift is critical, and that is linked to the development of productive capacities that UNCTAD has been highlighting for a number of years now. Now, the majority of LDCs remain dependent on primary commodities for exports, income, and employment, hence the concern, hence the emphasis on structural transformation. The second point is that the recovery, as Dr. Tesfachew has said, of LDC from recent global crisis, for example, in terms of growth rates, trade, investment flows, is also uneven and fraught with downside risks. In fact, when 2010 was a bit encouraging, there was a hopeful sign of recovery last year when they went up to 5.7% on average, from 2006, 4.6%. But unfortunately, as Dr. Tesfachew said, we are estimating that this year it will go down to about 5%. According to IMF, actually, it will be much lower than 5% for average for LDC as a whole, which is really a pity, because that means they remain below the 7% or so that they attained during the boom period. The third point I would like to highlight is similar trends also observed for trade investment flows. Again, compared to 2009, for example, LDC export performance in 2010 was a major improvement when it increased to $156 billion, but this is still less than the $176 billion exported in 2008. Dr. Tesfachew has mentioned in terms of FDI, again, is 20% lower than pre-crisis period. There was also concern that slow recovery in major economies and their continuing sovereign debt problems may have a dual effect of reducing both the amount of ODA and the remittances going to LDCs. All these are the discussed in Chapter 1 and 2. I'm just summarizing them for you as a way of assessing performance in recent years. The fourth point is that progress, as I said, in structural transformation, poverty reduction has been slow in LDCs, despite some of them attaining high level of economic growth and high income, especially the countries exporting oil. This continues to be, I think, it's a major concern. For example, between 2001 and 2007, 27 LDCs showed a decline in the share of manufacturing in their GDP. To us, this is tantamount to the deindustrialization process. This is a worrying trend, since it would mean that LDCs will continue to be locked into a low value added and commodity production and rely on imports for processed and manufactured products. It would also mean they will continue to play a marginal role in the world economy. The report provides some figures to show the extent of this marginalization of LDCs in the global economy. At present, for example, just to give you an example, LDCs have about 12% of the world population, but they account only for 0.9%, less than 1% of the world GDP. Dr. Tesfachew has already mentioned the trade picture, which they account only for 1%. That's because of oil. If you remove oil, it goes down to about 0.6%. Again, many of these LDC countries, and we should know because we help many of them, have been trying to improve their investment policy framework, open up, make create a very attractive environment for investment, and yet all of them attract only 2.5% of the world FDI inflows. The fifth point, an even more worrying trend and a persistent challenge, is that compared to other developing countries, the pace of poverty reduction in LDCs has been quite modest, despite somewhat favorable economic performance by many of these countries. This year's report actually looks at the distribution of people living in extreme poverty across developing countries. Extreme poverty defined in terms of below $1.25 per day. If you have the document with you, you can see in chart 13, page 33, some presentations there. Given the current trend in poverty reduction, as well as population dynamic, it's highly likely that over time LDCs will become, that's our assumption, a major locus of extreme poverty in the world. In fact, in 1990, only 18% of extreme poor lived in LDCs, while by 2007, the share has gone to 36%, which means the bulk of reduction in terms of the global picture in poverty happened mainly in Asia, particularly China. Now, against this background, a very somewhat depressing picture, the subject of this year's LDC report, namely South-South cooperation, is all the more topical at the present juncture, especially in light of the slow recovery in LDC traditional markets and development partners. It's obvious that LDCs will have to search for opportunities elsewhere, and large and dynamic developing countries as well as regional partners can be expected to acquire a more prominent role as growth engines, not only for LDCs, but also perhaps for other low-income developing countries as well. Chapter 2 of this report illustrates how in the span of a decade, economic ties with southern partners have intensified remarkably and have become a crucial dimension of LDC's integration into the world economy. Again, some of these figures have been mentioned, but let me repeat them. Developing countries contributed to nearly half of the expansion in LDC's total merchandise exports over the past decade. And their importance has been steadily on the rise across the whole spectrum of the LDCs. Dr. Tesfachew mentioned in 2009, they observed nearly 69 billion of LDC merchandise exports. This is over half of the total. The composition of these trade flows, however, are not much different from traditional pattern of trade. And this fact underscores once more LDC's structural weakness. They're still relying on primary commodities for 90% of their exports. And beyond trade, southern economies are also providing the LDCs with greater access to capital, particularly in the form of FDI. 40%, as Dr. Tesfachew said, now comes from other developing countries. Still focused on extractive industries, but there are signs of incipient diversification of this South-South FDI flows towards other areas, manufacturing, information technology, tourism, and finance. Moreover, there are reasons to believe that South-South FDI can be particularly well placed to facilitate technological transfers and engage in more innovative and relevant innovations. This year's report also shows that economic relations of LDCs with other developing countries encompass a wide range of areas, including, interestingly, on the migration side and development cooperation. Actually, I personally didn't know until the report that the bulk of migrants from LDCs actually go to other developing countries. And that over 60% of nearly 26 billion of remittances inflows to LDCs in 2010 originated in other developing countries. And so in terms of remittance as well, that the picture is changing. As for South-South development cooperation, in spite of being small compared to the traditional North-South aid, the report shows that it plays a significant role in the development of LDCs, thanks to its modalities, which are potentially complementary to those of traditional donors, and to the overwhelming focus on productive sectors and infrastructural provisions. In Africa, for instance, where the infrastructure funding gap is in the order of 10 billion a year, it's estimated that in 2007 alone, the Chinese financial commitments to infrastructure projects total 4.5 billion, which is very significant, nearly half. With other players, with other relevant players, including India, Brazil, and other countries from Middle East also providing sizable contributions. Overall, therefore, emerging partnerships between LDCs as the developing countries have intensified remarkably over the last decade. While we do not claim that South-South cooperation is a panacea to the problems facing LDCs, it can nevertheless serve as a springboard for developing their productive capacities and meeting the objectives of inclusive growth. Ultimately, at the end of the day, of course, the mode of interaction and engagement between each LDC and the southern partners will determine the developmental outcome of this complex process. The net result is contingent on the implementation of appropriate policies, strategic, and I would add to this, pragmatic approach to their relationship with other developing countries. Now, other important issues addressed in the report include the role of the state, as Dr. Tesfachew said, the regional integration of development of LDCs. Given that financing development, in particular productive capacity, remain a major challenge for LDCs, the report also examines the role of regional and sub-regional development banks as an important source of finance and proposes new modalities through which a small proportion of reserves accumulated by developing countries can be invested in LDCs. Now, this aspect of the report will be a subject of an in-depth discussion this afternoon in a special session with experts in these fields. However, let me very briefly, at the end, finally, highlight 2 points. First, the report argues that learning from other more successful developing countries, again, as Dr. Tesfachew highlighted, LDCs should build a strong, effective state with a clear development agenda and focus, and with a capacity to mobilize resources and direct investment into productive sectors. It further argues that because of their starting positions, economic vulnerability, and weak resource base, LDCs need a different type of developmental state, one that's catalytic and enabler, and more focused on mobilizing resources for investment and creating an appropriate policy environment for private sector development. In this context, therefore, the coordinating function of the state is stressed. Secondly, on regional integration and its potential role in harnessing the opportunities offered by a wide range of southern partners, the report analyzes and presents as a possible model, again, Dr. Tesfachew mentioned it, the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Program in Asia. A graphic picture is presented in page 103, just for your interest. And this program is coordinated by Asian Development Bank, and we believe it could serve as a successful example of developmental regionalism. What makes this regional integration initiative special and worth considering in other regions is that it's not focused on creating free market access only, but the development of the region as a whole, including the weaker members of the sub-region, a little bit like the European Union model. Therefore, it's concerned with development within the sub-region, as well as the strategic integration of the sub-region as a whole into the world economy. Let me stop here, and I thank you for your attention.